And so we're very excited to be able to host this event tonight with UCL. And hopefully we'll try not to make it too technical, but I might not be able to stop myself from asking some many questions. So tonight we're going to hear from Dan Susskind, who has written this excellent book, Growth Reckoning, available in all bookshops and outside, I believe, in the drinks afterwards. And I'm going to ask Dan to tell us a bit about the book. But I think it's a really interesting exploration of a concept that so dominates our political discourse. And yet, that's a concept as well, which the public debate doesn't always totally comprehend, or can fall into quite kind of sharp dragons in terms of what it means. We have excellent respondees as well. So we have Professor Diane Coyle, who is Bennett Professor of Public Policy at the University of Cambridge, and a renowned expert on productivity, and how we should think about it, as well as how we achieve it. And we have Lukasz Rachel, who is Assistant Professor of Economics at UCL, so we'll look with her, Lukasz, and a real expert, again, guide us through some of these themes. But first of all, I want to start with some opening remarks from Daniel. Now, Daniel, you've written a number of books that all does extremely well, and have really kind of opened people's eyes to these different concepts and AI and future work, future questions, and so on. Could you tell us a little bit about this book and perhaps a bit about your motivations for writing it as well?
Okay, I actually have some slides which I'm away, if that's okay with you. Yeah. Terrific. Great. So let me just begin by saying thank you very much to UCL and to APR for hosting this evening. And to talk, and thank you to respondents as well for joining us. I thought I'd talk for just to give a flavour of the book, just talk about 20 minutes or so, if that's okay, and then we can have a conversation amongst ourselves. So let me dive straight in. Again, a real pleasure to be here to be talking about my new book. 3 facts, and this is just really important framing. 3 facts have defined the economic history of human beings until now. The first is that for most of the 300,000 years that human beings have been around, economic life was essentially stagnant. So whether you were a hunter-gatherer working away in the Stone Age or someone from the 18th century, you're likely to have lived a stagnant economic life, stuck in a unforgiving struggle for subsistence. The second fact is that it was only very, very recently that this stagnation came to an end. Modern economic growth began just 200 years ago. And the third fact is that human beings have managed to maintain their economic ascent. So whenever growth had happened in the past, it had been limited and fizzled out. But this time it was both significant and sustained. And so the first part of this book is about this extraordinary history, this very recent escape. Why there was no growth for so long, why it suddenly begins, and how it's been sustained. The second part of the book is how growth came to occupy such a central role in our common life. Today we live in societies that prioritize growth, where our collective success is determined by how much stuff we're able to produce in a given amount of time. But what's fascinating is that before the 1950s, almost no politicians, economists, policymakers, anyone was talking about the idea of economic growth as a policy objective. And I think this Google Ngram captures it quite nicely, that before 1950, there's almost no mention of the idea of economic growth in published material. More importantly, even if we had wanted to pursue growth as a policy priority, it would have been incredibly difficult to do so. Until the 1940s, there wasn't really a reliable way of measuring the size of the economy, whether it was growing, and if so, by how much. So as time has passed, we've used this extraordinary material prosperity to achieve remarkable outcomes, freeing billions from the struggle for subsistence that haunted our ancestors, making the average human life far longer and far healthier than ever before, funding discoveries that have transformed our understanding of the world, such as splitting the atom, cracking the genetic code, starting to explore the stars. But it's also increasingly clear that this pursuit of prosperity has come at an enormous price. The destruction of the natural environment, the desolation of local cultures and communities, the emergence of vast inequalities between those who have received the greatest share of this wealth and those who have not, the creation of new technologies whose disruptive effects on work and politics, I'm thinking of AI in particular, it's not clear yet we can properly control. And so growth also presents us now with a dilemma that on the one hand is associated with many of our greatest triumphs and achievements, but on the other hand is also associated with many of the greatest problems that we confront today as well. And the third part of the book explores this growth dilemma, setting out kind of extraordinary promise of growth that is associated with almost every measure of human flourishing, but also this extraordinary price as well, that it is behind many of the great challenges that we face too. Tonight, though, just in these few minutes, I just want to focus less on that history, which is the first half of the book, and more on the future, which is the second half of the book, what we should actually do about the growth dilemma in the real world. One response is the pretty blunt demand that the degrowth movement is famous for supposedly making. If growth is the problem, then less growth seems to be their solution. And this is the starting point. I'm going to, this is where I'm going to start. But I'm also going to argue that this sort of thing is a mistake, and in fact, a catastrophic one. I'm going to argue, in fact, that we need more growth. And the key insight here, and one I return to again and again in the book, it runs through my arguments, is that what really matters in driving economic growth is the discovery of new ideas about the world. And as a result, increasing technological progress. But I also want to argue that we should use all the tools at our disposal to try and make it a different type of growth as well. Simply ploughing on with more growth alone will be to repeat the mistakes of the past. Finally, I want to close by raising the question as to whether or not we necessarily can change the nature of growth, and what we ought to do if we cannot. So that is the plan for the next 15 minutes or so. Let me begin then with degrowth. How should we respond to this growth dilemma? It's clear we can't continue in the past, so should we simply slow down the growth of our economies or even shrink them? And so this is this degrowth idea that if growth is the problem, then less growth, and in particular negative GDP growth, ought to be the solution. And I think it's important to explore this idea. To begin with, it's increasingly influential. Interest in it might have begun among a small group of ecologically minded academics, but it's now spread far and wide. You have politicians like Caroline Lucas, environmentalists like David Attenborough, activists like Greta Thunberg, all appealing in different ways to this idea of degrowth. I think for that reason, not exclusively, but that reason alone is a good reason to take it seriously. I also think that some of the misunderstandings in the degrowth discussion reflect just fundamental misconceptions about how it is that growth actually works. And one of the things I'm trying to do in the book is try and address some of those misconceptions too. So what actually is degrowth? I mean, one of the great frustrations, and I set out kind of intellectual history of the idea of degrowth, is that it's actually quite difficult to figure out exactly what it is that different supporters of the movement are talking about. And so I think a useful starting point is to look at how people actually use it in practice. And when you do that, what you see is people talking about degrowth for two different reasons. The first is because it gives them a diagnosis of what's gone wrong in the world. And the second is because it gives them a set of tools for thinking about how we ought to respond. So take each of these in turn. Take the diagnosis of what's gone wrong in the world. I think the best articulation of this was Greta Thunberg in that famous 2019 speech at the United Nations Climate Action Summit, where she stood up and said, "My message is we will be watching you. You've stolen my dreams and my childhood with your empty words. We are in the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you?" So I think, the first part of what she's saying there is essentially that our current growth path is unsustainable. And I think the spirit of this part of the diagnosis is unimpeachable. Indeed, the argument of the book is that growth isn't simply climate destroying, but it's also inequality creating. It's work threatening, it's politics undermining, it's community disrupting. There are, in fact, more dimensions to the price of growth than the degrowthers and the environmental movement in particular focus on. But there's another part to the degrowth diagnosis as well, and this is this more provocative claim that continued growth is infeasible as well. And this belief has appeared in various forms over time, but it's been sort of sanded down into a popular slogan, which is that infinite growth is not possible on a finite planet. Lots of people appeal to this idea. The argument of the book, though, is that this is wrong, that infinite growth, or effectively infinite growth, is possible on a finite planet. And I think a big part of the problem here is that this idea of a finite planet is rooted in a very old-fashioned view of economic activity. I think the origins of this view are understandable. So when the founding fathers of the field, people like Smith, Mill, Marx, Ricardo, and so on, were working in the 18th and 19th centuries, the British economy around them was overwhelmingly made up of farms and factories. So people worked with their hands, they used tools and machines. Inputs into production and outputs out of production could readily be counted. And it's true that in a solely material world, there are obvious physical limits on economic activity. There are only so many acres of land that can be farmed, only so much raw material for production. But focusing just on the material world distracts us from how growth actually works. Growth doesn't come from using more and more finite resources, as many tend to assume, more land, more people, more raw materials, and so on. Growth comes instead by discovering ever more productive ways of combining the finite resources that we have. In other words, growth comes, and this again is a key argument of the book, it comes from technological progress. So another way to think about this is that growth doesn't come from the world of tangible objects, the things we can see and touch out there in the world, but it comes from the intangible world of ideas. So what do I mean by ideas? I mean recipes or instructions for organizing atoms in the world, or just more prosaically, recipes or instructions for making more productive use of the resources that we have. And the key point here is that whereas the planet of tangible resources might be finite, the universe of those intangible ideas is just unimaginably vast, for all intents and purposes, as good as infinite. Just one way to hammer this point home is to think of a kitchen larder, and imagine this kitchen larder has 300 ingredients in it. It's a well-stocked larder, but it's got finite ingredients. 300 finite ingredients. The key point, though, is that there are more possible recipes for combining those ingredients than there are atoms in the universe. And exactly the same argument applies when we're thinking about growth, when we're dealing not with finite ingredients in a larder, but quite literally all the materials in the world. Then there's degrowth as a solution, and if we understand it to mean intentionally stopping the growth of the global economy or shrinking it outright, then my argument is that this would be one of the most catastrophic acts of self-harm that humankind can really inflict upon itself. As the economist Branko Milanovic points out, if we interpret degrowth as meaning freezing global GDP per head, that would either imply leaving 800 million people in extreme poverty, or if you find that unacceptable, you're going to have to find a way of slashing the incomes of the 7.1 billion people that remain, basically all of the Western population. And the key argument here is that growth, particularly in the 20th century, has been revolutionary, but it's been an unfinished revolution. And this, I think, is what the degrowth movement, just in spirit, too often fails to appreciate. It's just so extraordinarily unimaginative to think that our current economic lot is the best that we can ever do. That we've reached some kind of economic peak, and that what we ought to do now is press pause, not simply for the next 10 years or 10,000 years, but for all of time to come. So my starting point is that we need more. If growth were to fizzle out, it would just be a disaster. And so the big question is, how on earth do we do that? And what's really interesting is that although today politicians and policymakers talk very confidently about the causes of growth, what happens when you spend time with the economic literature is that actually there's a great deal of mystery about it. there's a great deal that has to be solved. I thought Elhanan Heltman, the economist, put it well when he said, for centuries, economists have been preoccupied with the growth of nations, but the subject has proved elusive and many mysteries remain. There is just a great deal of uncertainty about what the drivers of growth really are. That said, I do think from all this uncertainty, we can draw one important lesson, and I've sort of hinted at it already, which is that more growth fundamentally comes from more technological progress. And in my reading of what we have discovered, that technological progress comes from discovering more ideas about the world, more ideas about how to use the finite resources that we have more efficiently, more effectively. And so the big question seems to me is, how do we become the sort of society that generates more ideas? And I think there are 4 different dimensions to this, and I'll just very quickly just whip through these just to give you a flavor. One, to reform our pretty antiquated intellectual property regime. The set of rules and regulations that governs who gets to own and control ideas that are created. 2, invest vastly more in research and development. We cannot expect a steady stream of discoveries about the world, new ideas about the world, unless we invest seriously in their discovery. 3rd, we need to get more people involved in the parts of the economy that actively generate ideas. And finally, we ought to be using technology itself to help us generate ideas. And that's, I think, one of the radical ideas, perhaps is something we can talk about more in discussion. So the starting point is that we need more growth. But if growth is allowed, it would be a catastrophe. But the growth dilemma that I set out before can't be solved by that alone. On the contrary, it's going to be made worse if we simply plow on ahead in pursuit of more prosperity. And so what we've also got to do is try and use every tool at our disposal to change the nature of growth as well, to choose a different type of growth path. So just to see one example of what I mean by this, think about one dimension of the price of growth, the harmful effect it has on the climate. If you go back to 2007, the British government publishes the Stern Review, first report of its kind on the economics of climate change, written by Sir Nicholas Stern. And one of the central conclusions in that report was that if you wanted to reduce emissions by 80%, it would cost you 1% of GDP per year. In other words, there was a very strong trade-off between growth and the environment. You had to pay a high price in terms of growth to protect the environment. The next year, Nicholas Stern came out and said, actually, I've got it wrong. Climate change is worse than I thought. It's actually going to cost us 2% of GDP per year. So the trade-off between growth and the environment had got worse. We have to pay a higher price in terms of growth to protect the environment. Fast forward, though, a decade and a half, and if you look at the work done by the Climate Change Committee, so the group of experts tasked with advising the British government on the challenge of climate change, what's very interesting is that they conclude that the cost of eliminating emissions, so not simply reducing them by 80%, but eliminating them, had fallen to just 0.5% of GDP per year. In other words, the trade-off between growth and the environment had dramatically improved. You had to pay a far lower price now to protect the environment. So the big question, the interesting question is why? What happened over the last 15 years that meant the price of protecting the environment fell? And the answer to that is because technological progress, particularly in renewable energy, meant it was possible to grow the economy without causing as much harm to the environment. And more specifically, 15 years of changes in taxes and subsidies, rules and regulations, and social norms and cultures just completely transformed the incentives that people faced in society, creating an extremely strong incentive for entrepreneurs and inventors, not only to develop new technologies, and that's the stuff that drives growth, but to develop particular types of technologies, namely those that do less harm to the environment and in turn for companies and households to adopt. So the result was not simply a technological revolution, but in many senses a green technological revolution. And I think the great example of this is what's happened with solar energy over the last few decades. So it begins in the 1970s as a tool of last resort to generate electricity in isolated lighthouses and outer space, but today it's completely commonplace. Why is it commonplace? Because technological progress meant there was an exponential decline, 200-fold decrease in the cost of generating electricity via solar, and similarly, an exponential increase in the uptake of solar energy at the same time. And so the practical consequence of this has been that over the last 15 years or so, more and more countries have been able to increase their GDP while at the same time reducing emissions in absolute terms. And that's the sort of thing that just back in 2007, and that Stern Review has been written, would have just seemed very, very difficult for people to imagine in the absence of the technological changes that have taken place. And so, one of the most important themes of the book is that we shouldn't underestimate the power of incentives to shape or to direct the sorts of technological progress that takes place in society and the nature of economic growth that we enjoy as a result. We can change these incentives, we can change the types of technological progress that we enjoy, and we can change the nature of the growth that unfolds as a result if we want to. And so what I do is look at each of those different dimensions of the price of growth and try and explain how we can use the tools that we have, taxes and subsidies, rules and regulations, social norms and custom, to try and change those incentives that people face and change the types of technologies that we develop. So we can get technologies that promote growth, but also protect the other things that we might care about in society, whether it's a better environment, a more equal society, the availability of good work, a healthier politics, flourishing local places and communities. But in the end, and this is where the book ends, we have to accept that we might not always be able to do this. And the final task that we face is perhaps the hardest of all. When we cannot change the nature of growth, are we willing to sacrifice growth in those cases to protect other important outcomes that we care about? Now, there is lots of economists would argue that the way to respond to this challenge is to revise GDP, to try and capture other valuable things that we care about in society, a better environment, levels of inequality and so on, and bundle them into the GDP measure, sort of GDP plus or some other sort of measure. And I think that's a mistake. And the argument that I make is that this is a mistake because these questions about what other ends we ought to value and how much we ought to value them are not technical questions about measurement, but they are moral questions about what matters. And as a result, because they are moral questions, the place for them is politics. They're questions for citizens to answer. They're questions that are going to invite, as we see they do, immense disagreement. And what I propose is political innovation to support greater citizen involvement. Political institutions that will bring citizens together to debate these sorts of issues again and again and again. And I think we can already capture an encouraging glimpse of what I have in mind in action today. The rise of so-called mini publics, so citizen assemblies, citizen juries, citizen panels on the rise in OECD countries over the last few decades. And we've seen them being used to engage not just with trivial questions, but some of the hardest questions you can ask in some of the hardest places to ask them, whether it's abortion in Ireland or euthanasia in France or energy policy in Korea. And I think similarly, for some of these difficult trade-offs between growth and other things that we value, we need these sorts of institutions. Again, these are moral questions, not technical ones, questions for citizens and not technical experts. So let me just finish in the last minute on a note of optimism. Fundamentally, the book is an optimistic book, and I think it's important just to emphasize why. Today, we live in an age of anxiety where almost every day we're reminded, particularly in Britain, of the sort of existential risks that we face and our supposed incapacity for dealing with them. But as I said, the argument in the book is an optimistic one, that in a sense what we have is an existential opportunity in front of us too. What I try and do is describe an opportunity that we have now for moral renewal, an opportunity to pay more attention to the other valuable ends that we've tended to neglect until now. And I think we can do so from a position of strength, looking out to the future, far more technologically capable and materially prosperous than ever before in that 300,000 year history. There's a great quotation from the late philosopher Derek Parker when he says, "We have the power not only to make life good in decades to come, but to make it better in ways that we now cannot even imagine." Nothing, in my view, can be more important than that, and that is what this book is all about. So I will finish there, a few minutes over, and look forward to the conversation and hearing some reflections as well. So thank you very much.
Fantastic, thank you very much. I think there's a really clear description of the main arguments in the book, and you preempted some of my questions. So
I know it's a slightly more good answer to your question.
fantastic. So I think in that case, I'm going to come straight to our respondents, and then we can open up to discussion. So Diane, sorry, can I ask you to?
Yes. So thank you very much. I really enjoyed the book. But I think it'd be more fun if I could go through it. So a lot of my work has been about economic measurement and thinking about GDP. You know, if I tell people parties that I work on economic statistics, they will generally edge away quickly. And you don't need to talk to me afterwards, it's fine. But I think the measures are important. So I think the debate about GDP and beyond GDP is an important one. Because measurements shift how people respond. They change how businesses think the economy is going and their expectations of future markets, and it changes government policies and what governments do as well. And as Daniel showed in the engram, politicians only used to talk about economic growth, even during the first period of modern economic growth. It was a phenomenon of the Cold War and a famous debate between Khrushchev and Nixon about, Kennedy about whose system was going to do the best. And there's a very nice book by Matthias Schmelzer about why growth then got written into the OECD statutes and became totemic. And it has become the thing that all politicians in all countries think is important to measure their performance by. And it correlates with things that voters care about, because in this country we've had the experience of sacrificing growth for some other value, Brexit, and people don't like it. We've had 15 years of median incomes not growing, and we're seeing adverse political consequences of that. So I think the metric that you use is important. And pretty much any economist would say, yes, but it's got to be sustainable. So how do we think about developing economic measures that are widely used, that have consensus around them among the economics and statistics and policy communities that actually capture what we're doing to the environment, because we've not been paying the price for all of the use of resources and the changes in the atmosphere. So part of my work is exactly about thinking about natural capital, biodiversity. How would you think about assigning a price to them so that we pay that price? We've been treating it as free good, it's not free, and that bill is coming to you. So I do think the measures are important, and I think there's a way of expanding official economic statistics by, in effect, creating a balance sheet of the economy that looks at assets that create the capacity for future prosperity. Nature is one of them, human health and well-being is another of them, so we call it human capital in economics, very unromantic, but that's important too. But also things like cultural assets, heritage assets. Let's think about all of the things that make for the good life and put them in the same kind of measurement framework so that we can think about the trade-offs that are involved there. So I'm not going to throw away GDP. I don't think it's useless. It's correlated with things, but I want to develop another set of metrics that guide policy and business decisions. And if I can plug my own book, I'm writing about this currently. I've got to write it before the end of June, and it'll be out in 2025. So please come back to an event next year and we'll talk about that in more detail. So the other thing I want to talk about is ideas, and I completely agree that we've got this intuition that growth is something material. We think about it as more cars, it's more handbags, and of course we've got more stuff than people did even when I was growing up a million years ago. But the increment to economic growth now, the extra economic value that's being added is already incredible. I first wrote about this in 1997 in a book called The Weightless World. It was already then the case that for 20 years, growth in GDP the increase in economic values had decoupled from material use. And so there's a growing wedge between the material footprint of the developed economies, even accounting for trade, and the economic value that's being created. And that's because it's things like we now have small smartphones that have replaced 100 other gadgets that were originally big objects. It's because a lot of value is created by medical ideas that are not particularly resource intensive. If we wanted to degrow and somebody came along with a vaccine for the next pandemic, we would need to take something away so that the increments are intangible. But actually, I think it's not the ideas themselves that are important so much as the use of the ideas. And so the politics that I've looked to is what are the institutions that shape who gets access to what ideas? Who is going to price modern personalised genomic medicines, and who will ensure that all of that's available through a sustainable NHS or whatever your health system is. So I'm wary of technocratic solutions to economic problems in the climate context, for carbon capture and storage. You don't know if it works, you don't know if it works to scale. So the technology will be important, but using the technology is something that I would emphasize much more. Thanks.
Yes, thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this panel. I really enjoyed the book. I thought I'm going to start kind of picking up on also where Diane's finished on an exciting thread that's running through the book for me, which is this idea of ideas, basically, right? So the concept of ideas is very clearly introduced in the book. You know, the exciting stuff about it is that ideas are very different to traditional goods. They're non-rival, okay? So many people can use ideas all at once. People in the past used the same ideas as we use today, and people in the future will use these ideas. And that really changes the economics of, the economics of growth, really. And the book very nicely describes, you know, the evolution of the basically history of economic thought about how, you know, Romer in particular arrived at this notion that these non-rival ideas generate increasing returns, and that allows for sustained economic growth. They're also very important from all these cost perspectives, right? So take the environmental, cost perspective. If we can come up with ideas of making more stuff, like more GDP out of a given set of inputs, then that's the true technology growth that grows the size of the pie at the same time diminishes the costs, right? Because it allows us to develop in a more clean, more sustainable way. Also, the notion of ideas also introduces, it also has some question marks around it, at least when it comes to the future of growth. So in the book, Daniel describes this notion that perhaps we have picked all the easy and good ideas already. So the low-hanging fruit type of hypothesis. And I think that's one of at least in academic research, it's a very powerful idea that you have this low-hanging fruit element, and so it's going to be the research productivity that we can imperfectly, but we can still measure, has been declining over time, and so there's a question of whether that phenomenon is going to weigh very much on the perspective of future growth. At the same time, the alternative perspective that maybe I would like to see a little bit more in the book is this standing on the shoulders of giant effects, right? And in particular, coming up with a new idea today will probably help future researchers do their work as well. In particular, if the ideas are sort of in this sphere where they really impact the research process themselves. And I think some of the latest innovations, AI included, have some promise, as is also described in the book, to sort of deliver that kick. Then, as Daniel mentioned in the introduction, this world of ideas also generates quite a clear answer to the question of whether sustained growth is possible on a finite planet. Like this combinatorial approach, I think, is a very clear exposition of this issue. And there's also a lot of policy implications that come of thinking about ideas. So let me talk about policy implications, in particular focusing on the ones that I think are more controversial in the book, or maybe the ones that I don't sort of fully agree with, or at least the ones that we should discuss. So, one implication of or one policy recommendation the book gives is that we should try to steer ideas in the right direction, right? We need different type of growth. I just wanted to point out that this is, in many situations, much more difficult to do than in practice. But basically, it's difficult to do in practice sometimes, right? So think about the impact of technologies on inequality. We think that some technologies have replaced workers from their current tasks, and that generates the inequality. The problem is that ex ante, it's very difficult to know which technologies are going to be complementing workers versus substituting for workers. Take an example of an ATM. It seems like ATM is going to substitute a lot of bank clerks, right? That is obvious, like it substitutes for the tasks that people are doing in the pre-ATM era. But in the event, in the bank branches today across the US and Europe, actually more people are working in bank branches than before the introduction of the ATM, because the banks found new tasks for these people, much more productive tasks, and therefore, it resulted in actually, increased demand for labor in that particular sector. So, if this example, which seems pretty clear cut, even there we can get it wrong, I think we need to be very humble in how ex ante we can, figure it out which technology is going to be sort of good for workers versus bad. So that's an example where I think steering is going to be very difficult. Where steering might be easier is in the environmental space, because we know exactly, roughly we know which technologies are cleaner than others, right? So we can impose something along the lines of a carbon tax that will naturally, through the price system, steer the innovation of activity towards cleaner stuff. And I think that's so we just need to be mindful that our ability to steer is going to be very heterogeneous. Another thing that I think is important, and maybe I would mention in the book a bit more, is that one of the challenges that we face right now is that technologies can be very disruptive, but they can also bring very little growth at the same time. Okay, so I think in the literature, because of Darren Acemoglu calling it that way, it's becoming known as social technologies. So the idea is that, take automation, for example, firms will automate potentially large chunks of their activities if the machines are just slightly cheaper than the workers. But these machines might not actually be sort of much better at all, right? So we can get a lot of disruption in the labor market or in local communities for very little growth. And that's where this distinction between technology and growth is really important, right? Because technology can be very disruptive, but it can be very little growth. There can be very little growth that this technology generates. And I think those are the examples in particular where the policy could usefully focus on. And then finally, because I'm probably massively over time, but let me just pick up one more controversial policy recommendation that Danny recommends. So the book focuses on these ideas and how to propel them forward. At the same time, therefore, I guess putting more question mark, over the desirability of the traditional recipes, like invest in education, invest in infrastructure, those things that are not at the core of developing the intangible idea economy. And I think this argument makes a lot of sense, and it's very refreshing because it's kind of like boring to hear the same thing over and over again, that we should just invest in the infrastructure, etc. So it's very refreshing to hear the opposite argument. One challenge to this, I think, is that this argument might be more correct or less correct depending on the stage of development. So in particular, I would like to hear your thoughts on the question of whether that argument applies as forcefully to US and the UK versus countries that are behind the frontier. In particular, China and other countries in Asia are growing. They experience growth miracles through in part through a lot of infrastructure spending. And so I wonder whether you draw different sort of policy recommendations for these different stages.
Can I piggyback on one of these points just to demonstrate how important the measurement is and how difficult it is to have good intuitions about what we're talking about. And that's this idea of socio-technologies. So the example I want to give of a technology that was disruptive is conventional safety razor. Men used to go to barbers to get their beards shaved, and it was disruptive once they could get a cheap razor and do it at home themselves. So as much shaving was going on that was happening in the household, it wasn't measured. And productivity looked like, if anything, it had declined as a result of that. But then hairdressers found other things to do, so their activity stayed level. But productivity went down. But does that mean that the invention of the safety rings is a bad thing? Was it a so-so technology? So these inventions do shift activity around in ways that make it quite hard to think about, well, what do we mean by growth and what do we mean by broader measures of income? Sorry,
just thank you guys for his comments. Daniel, I wonder if you want to cut that question on infrastructure and kind of stages of development and how it shapes what's actually needed.
Yeah. So I mean, it's true that in the book I am more skeptical of sort of traditional ideas for how we particular things around infrastructure, building trains, roads, bridges, education, to some extent, housing. That said, I mean, I think I'm quite firm in sort of being critical of these things, that you have to do so from a position of modesty, that we know in the context of how little and how mysterious the process of growth is. You can't really feel too confident about any place that you think about the process. You can find evidence for almost any rate of growth you want to show that it drives growth. So, but the reason why, the general reason why I'm more skeptical of those things is because I think often they are, as I said, that example, based on quite old-fashioned conceptions of growth. What matters is big, impressive things that physical, tangible world, and that actually what drives growth is often not that. And one example, it's not a book, but I did the calculation recently. I said I took high speed 2 and I said, let's look at how they value the let's look at the way in which the government valued the first stage of that project. And the way they do it is by looking, the argument is that the train will be faster, it will save time, that time is valuable, and add up with that saved time, and will give you the value of the. And I said, okay, as anybody who goes on the British train network will know, one of the most frustrating things about it is how bad the Wi-Fi is. And I spend a huge amount of time wasted waiting for the Wi-Fi to connect, disconnected, connecting. And so I said, using the same valuation, let's ask, what would the value be of fixing Wi-Fi in the British train network, using exactly the same approach to valuation, and using the available estimates of how much time people spend on the internet and trains. And so anyway, long story short, the value that I found to fixing the Wi-Fi in the British train network was a third of the value of the entire first stage of high speed 2. But the kicker is that would come at 1/250 of the cost. It's about 200 million. So in terms of value for money, even if I'm out by an order of magnitude of those calculations, I guess pretty conservative assumptions. Fixing the Wi-Fi is 2 to 3 times better value in the whole of the first stage of investment 2. Now, the fact that those sorts of ideas are barely discussed just, I think, reflects the fact that where we are in terms of thinking about growth is still in quite an old-fashioned conception. To answer your question on, so that's why I tend to be more conservative with respect to those traditional interventions in the sort of material part. The question of whether or not those things might apply in other less developed settings, I think the answer is I'd be far less skeptical of some of those things, depending upon. I think the most interesting issue in thinking about countries which are at a different stage in the process of development is with respect to technology transfer. So, for instance, I think one of the biggest things that the UK can do with respect to climate change is to allow countries like China and India to have far greater access to clean technologies with a far more affordable way. One of the ways we can get the biggest market environment. So I think I don't think technology has an important story actually, and the types of technologies that these countries are using as they develop. But I can see that some countries in other stages of development, those arguments are arguments what were in the 18th and 19th century, but it's actually quite a good way of thinking about
Can I press you slightly on the
Yes.
infrastructure?
yes,
Because I guess even if you think about ideas of source of growth, a lot of people would say that actually you need to create clusters and having them come into contact with
Yes.
each other in order for those ideas to thrive and new
Yeah.
uses of them to be found. And so, yes, in sectors too, but there's also kind of, could you have public transport networks beyond cities that are not London in the UK, for example?
Yeah.
And what would the effect of that be? Could you link up northern cities and so on?
Yeah.
And how important is that kind of infrastructure in terms of developing new combinations of those
Yeah.
ideas?
yeah. And so that is why I think that's exactly one of so Paul Romer, who's the economist who wrote a lot of this work on the importance of ideas, one of his flagship policy proposals is this idea of charter cities, that you could just build these kind of particular places where you would come together and share ideas with you. And so I think what's important to note there is that the argument is that you're doing these things not for them themselves, but in order to support the creation of distribution of ideas. And there's also lots of other ways of doing it. So, the fact, for instance, that during the if you look at what happened with remote work during the pandemic, that we now, if you look at the data in the US, it's something like people spent about 5% of full-time days working from home before the pandemic. It rose to about 60% during the pandemic. It's now stabilized in many parts of the world at about 30%. The fact that we are now working at a sixfold, we are working remotely, particularly in white collar work, with a sort of sixfold compared to what we were 3 or 4 years ago. That, that's the sort of thing that takes away from we need to be bumping into each other. I think there's again, I make these sort of arguments from a position of honesty and uncertainty. We don't know much about it, but it seems to me we are overrating the importance of the material policies relative to the stability. And I'd be quite interested in a similar calculation whether or not improving the Wi-Fi network in particular. Sorry. Well, quite, but like to look at what the value for money of that would be relative to the extraordinary cost of redoing houses.
I have one more question for you, which takes a step back at the historical view. I know you cover a lot of economic history in
Yes.
the book. So, I think, and I can be able to agree with a lot of what you've written, trying to put my mind in the place of people who might
Yes.
disagree with you on something.
Yeah.
Those moments of innovation that kind
Yeah.
of spurred on growth. Some people have argued that they've come about at a time when various things have been exploited. The sort of the cheap things, whether it's nature, whether it's kind of cheap labour, whether it's women's work, or even in today's economy, whether it's data.
Yeah.
I just wondered if you could reflect on what we can learn from those historical moments about how those young innovation happened, and perhaps reflect on that happened.
Yeah. Well, so the argument being that growth was driven not through ideas, but through, although at first glance it appears it's about one thing actually behind it.
Or even innovations have happened precisely because of these environments where there was a kind of resource that was enabling the kind of experimentation.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's, I wouldn't want to challenge that. And I think similarly, some of the worries that, some of the most important worries that people have about the technologies today, think about artificial intelligence. Those relate to similar things around exploitation. The data that the systems have been trained on, there is often behind some of this data, poorly paid human being who is labeling the data. So I wouldn't really want to. I wouldn't want to challenge that, but I don't think there's any. I wouldn't want to. I wouldn't agree with a sort of strong argument that growth is. That sort of exploitation is kind of necessary. it's been a fortunate future for in the past, but it doesn't necessarily need to be that way in the future. So it's one of the themes of the book is that we have more control, I think, over the kinds of technologies that we develop, over the sorts of growth that takes place. We tend to think that the way people talk about growth is that the kind of metaphor is like we're on a train. And the rails are set down. The only choice we have is about how fast we go. We have more or less growth, or technology or less technology. And I suppose what I'm trying to argue is that actually the better metaphor is that we're on a boat and we can choose our speed, but also our direction of travel too, by changing the incentives based on technologies. So it's sort of, yeah, so I wouldn't want to say the idea that there's kind of particular expectations have particular features.
And I have a question for your whole panel, which is about what would need to shift either in the economics profession or amongst policymaking community to actually take into account all the set of measures standards set out in those instances where there might be a trade-off. Perhaps if we start with policymaking, then our policymakers tend to return to the concept of growth, even if they go to nice governance, and I think that other measures that it should be taken into account. How could that shift?
I think it is shifting. Quite a few small countries and a lot of local authorities are actually very concerned about broader well-being metrics than just GDP growth. I mean, they care about the conventional growth in the jobs, but there's a huge interest in what's happening to the natural environment, in localities, state of health and public health, and even things like civic cohesion and social capital. So we have a framework which we call the wealth economy framework. It really just means thinking about assets in the economy's balance sheet, which has been taken up by quite a few local authorities here. So I think it's already happening. That's why the metrics are important. But we've got to shift the kind of official view as well to get it to be widely accepted, and that's working through national statistics, United Nations, and all of those, all of that machinery, and making sure that we can get the economists on board. Yes, it's an actual thing.
Okay, so I'm particularly interested in your views on economists as a group, and particularly macroeconomists. Can macroeconomics exist in a world in which we're thinking about what measures of growth?
Well, yeah, I think totally can. I think it already does in many dimensions, really. So if you take the climate, I mean the branch of macro that deals with climate is very well developed now. The integrated assessment models are widely used by climate scientists. House a few years ago got a Nobel Prize for it, so it got recognition by the whole profession. And obviously, there's still debates about how the model should be structured, and there's still many questions that people are grappling with. But I think that just means that there's a kind of a healthy debate there. In terms of core macro, there's been a massive shift towards thinking about moving away from representative agent models towards heterogeneous agent models, where welfare basically in these models goes well beyond consumption, right? So these models take very seriously the uninsured risks that the individuals are facing. So potentially, risks related to unemployment or to unstable job, etc. And those macro models are now basically workhorses, right? So most of that kind of research is done using those. So I think in general, an average macro paper would now have an actual welfare measure rather than, and that welfare measure, if it's an interesting paper, would very much deviate from market measure of output, right? So because of externality of some sort. Just one last thing to mention, which is more in the growth sort of literature. Also, there's been a wave of papers that try to really think about kind of longer term measures of welfare over time, adding consumption, i.e. GDP output, but also things like life expectancy, inequality and uncertainty about the income process, and kind of trying to add it all together and compare these sort of big welfare metrics across countries. I think that's a very fascinating area of research. I'm really like this paper. So that stuff exists. So I think this this criticism that economists only do look at GDP and nothing else. I think that's largely misplaced, and this when it comes to the frontier of academic research at the moment.
Did you have it?
Yeah, well, I think it's true, just on this this point about how economics responds to this issue of measurement. I think it's true that at the frontier there were lots of really interesting things going on. But if you look at the sort of what we actually teach aspiring economists, particularly I think that's one of my former students here this evening, Annie, and she would, I can't remember if we did growth economics together, but if we did, almost certainly every model that we would have looked at together would have just had y equals something. The only thing that would matter about growth would be output in sort of lots of the canonical stories that tell about growth. So I think there is a challenge for the economics profession getting some of that cutting edge or exciting reflects the real world thinking that's going on at Vanguard into the sort of bread and butter stuff that we teach aspiring economists, and that is where the bulk of teaching happens. So it's really important that teach there that reflects some of the exciting stuff that's going on as well.
So I'm going to open it up, and we'll try and take as many questions as possible. So, I will take a few at a time for the panel. Can I see some hands? So I will take a question here first. Hi, sorry, actually
It'd be really helpful as well to say who you are and where you're from, just so the question context. That'd be great.
Sure. Hi, I'm a professor of accounting from Monash University in Australia. And I'm curious because we saw in Australia drought, major drought. So we had lack food supply, which you'll have coming up. Then we had bushfires, and then we went into pandemic, all on all. So we're talking a lot about short-term modest thinking. I'm really curious how we bring the non-human voice into the voices of growth. And I just wondered how we do that.
Thank you. Carsten, that's your question too.
Hi, Carsten, senior economist at IPR. I thank you that the book really nicely brought together all the different strands of thinking about growth. But I wonder if in the presentation at least you give it a bit short drift, like where the usefulness of the argument could be. So in aggregate, we might do climate change mitigation and still get growth in the end, and in aggregate everything will be fine in 50 years. But in the interim, you might well have like certain sectors really having to shrink compared to counterfactual. So coal energy generation is an easy example. But most integrated settlement models will have airplane emissions be much or the airplane sector having degrowth compared to counterfactual, or the meat and fishing industry having degrowth compared to counterfactual. And more broadly, there will be significant sectoral economic costs. And the political backlash against a lot of these policies right now basically shows that people aren't prepared for degrowth in those sectors. And I think what the degrowth movement is saying is basically, because we don't have technological alternatives in these sectors on the horizon, right? We don't have low carbon cow's meat or milk. There will have to be degrowth in these sectors, and society needs to be prepared for this. And so I think in that sense, the Greta Thunbergs of this world, start an important societal debate that are in these integrated assessment models.
Great, I'll take one more question here.
Dan Tom from Greenpeace. Thank you, Sir Panel. Very interesting set of thoughts. I suppose I'm thinking about the politics of GDP, and I was like Daniel, you recognise that kind of steerage thing with the train. It's not just about going on the rails. You've got choices, and I guess trying to constrain the kind of growth we have is indeed kind of my day job in some way, of steers anyway. But I thought what it seems like to me, and please kind of correct me if I'm mistaken, is that there's quite a lot of institutional baggage that is committing us to the particular kind of GDP measures and approaches that we already have. So I think about, all sorts of the investment industry, the analysts, parts of the pension industry, the insurance industry, the people who advise them, ratings agencies, they're all committed. And by implication, we end up with a political system that's also heavily pushed to that. I suppose my question is that right? Because that's how it feels when I come across this debate. And if so, how does that get unpicked? Because otherwise, that we can have some good thoughts about what might be an alternative to the way in which we go about measuring of economic activity. But if those powerful actors who have immense political power remain in control of which metrics we should be using, it feels like it's going to be a long, hard fight. I feel like I've had too many of those and I might want to be a bit easier. Thank you. So any thoughts on that would be welcome.
Great, so we have 3 questions there, one about the non-communal voice and decision making, one on the conversation started by degrowth in terms of the disruption of certain sectors shrinking, and one on institutional baggage committing us to the current direction of growth. Do you want to give those to those?
Yeah, sure. On the issue of giving degrowth short shrift, I mean, I'm sympathetic to what you're describing, and as I said, one of the great frustrations with degrowth is that there's a huge amount of disagreement about exactly what it is that degrowth is agreeing on. You can find sort of extraordinary variety of views and interpretations and responses. It's partly because it's nature. There's a whole variety of reasons, but it's very difficult to actually dig down exactly what they're after. And so I think there are things. I think trying to work through it can be useful. And above all, one of the most useful lessons is that something has to give. The price of the sort of growth that we have at the moment is too high. But then I think some of the deeper lines of thought, are wrong in terms of on the issue of GDP. My view is that what we ought to do is not try and grow out GDP. What we ought to do is what I propose is something called GDP minimums, which is to try and encourage, try and fix the technical problems of GDP. That it's not, for various reasons, great expert on this. It's not even a good technical measure of the value of activity that takes place in the market for lots of reasons. It's free, very difficult to measure quality, and so on. So I think we ought to focus on how we resolve those technical problems with GDP. But I think attempts to then try and make it not simply a measure of market value, but a measure also of social value, to say that we ought to also try and capture the value of the environment or capital or levels of inequality, and put those into that and try and create a sort of more perfect number that captures some broader conception of social value. I think that's a mistake. So I say let's fix the technical problems for GDP, but let's recognize it for what it is, which is a limited and technical measure of market activity, and also try and promote other measures of other types of things that we find valuable.
I would disagree really strongly with that actually,
Yeah.
because GDP is not a technical measure. It's often described as a monetary measure of market activity, and it isn't. It's got government in there, it's got all kinds of imputations in there already. And once you start deflating monetary numbers to get so-called real GDP, you're turning it into a welfare measure already. And so I think there are not technical fixes, and we therefore ought to try to fix the metric that's being used. And actually, I would encourage you to know that there's more movement on that than I can remember any time that I've been working on these kinds of issues. And the process that's going through the UN hoops at the moment for validation to be the official statistics from 2025 will include measures of the depletion of natural capital cost that GDP growth is imposing on nature. It won't be very complete, it's incremental and not revolutionary, but I think that's a real step forward. And there's a lot of work going on to adjust for nature the metrics that are used in financial markets as well. My colleague Matthew Agarwala is recasting the kinds of credit ratings for sovereign debt and corporate debt, taking account of the risks that climate change and biodiversity are posed to GDP growth, and is in huge demand in central banks and in the investment community because that risk is being recognised. So I think the metrics are really important. I think they're not technical actually. And to come if I may to the Australian question, I've actually worked with a campaigner for Indigenous communities in Australia to try to figure out what is the value of that land and culture as an input into debates about reparations with the Australian government. So again, it won't be perfect, but one can get some numbers and start to make a difference.
Yes, but I'm familiar with that work in Australia, and it's nowhere near taking into account anything related to cultural or social value of the land in which these people had such a strong connection to. It's actually embarrassing.
It's not yet, but there's work going on.
I'm keen to ask Jeremy about this, and in terms of, because you obviously raised whether more deliberative processes have a role here, and does that speak to the issue of those?
Well, so, so this is a disagreement between me and Diane, which is that I think that GDP, that there is when you trace back history of GDP, there's kind of strong current thought that says we should try and make it a kind of rich and better social welfare, and then there are others who say actually that's not what we do. I think what we have at the moment is a bit of a muddle. The argument I'm making in the book is that these questions about what we choose to include in a sort of GDP plus or whatever measure you want to call it, these questions about what we choose to include, if not value of activity that takes place in a market, and in turn the question of how much weight we are to associate with them are, for exactly the kind of reasons that people say, they are really some of the most difficult questions that we can ask, and they are, in my view, deeply moral questions about what it is that we collectively value in society. And the way to resolve these disagreements is that we need to take these sorts of decisions out of treasuries and budget offices, and away from economists and technical experts, and instead put them in a deliberative political sense. These are the sorts of questions that need to be answered by systems through political processes, because they are so already charged. So in a sense, I think that, there's sort of agreement on the kind of.
I can take some more questions. I know there are quite a few. I'll take
Thank you. This has been a really interesting conversation. I just wanted to go back to your point about the decoupling of growth from resource use. And I just wanted to, I think one of the critiques of growth as a measure is that even if it can be decoupled from resource use, it does require infinite pushing against the horizon of what is used to extract value from, if that makes sense. So it kind of ultimately leads to a commodification of more and more of our lives. And so I just wanted to see if you had a comment about that, and about that kind of the financialization of housing rather than using homes.
Great. We'll take Phil with black.
I'm Seamus, I'm an intellectual historian. I'm interested in the connection. I wonder if you draw at all on John Stuart Mill, his notion of the stationary state, which I think you already have that kind of critique of growth and some of the language as such, but it's there implicitly in his chapter on principle of political economy in 1848, and his kind of proposal around cooperation as an alternative in maturity, labouring classes, and his advocacy of the art of living over simple kind of perpetual growth. So just wonder if you could draw it all.
One more.
Dominic, I came from Norwich, and I'm not an economist. Population demographics, what UN estimates the population is going to top out in the last half of this century. I can't remember the estimates vary, don't they? Maybe 10, 12 billion. At the same time, we've got aging populations of boomers like me, and at the same time, you've got fertility dropping. I mean, this must all feed into the idea of growth, and we don't know what population is going to do. So that's surely a big question mark for the economic growth.
Great.
Sure. Let me kick off with the last one because yeah. I mean, you identify a very exciting area of research actually, and a lot of people currently are doing work in academic economics about the link between population and also taking the two together, kind of broader societal implications, because most of the models that we have and the empirical evidence suggests that there's a strong positive relationship between population and growth. And the simplest channel to which this occurs is, again, like if growth is driven by ideas, then the number of brains that generates these ideas is going to be important as an overall driver of growth. And that's one of the reasons why we managed to break out of the Malthusian trap. And currently one of the hopes that when global economy joins in on this like global research effort with India and China joining in, etc., there's going to be more ideas from there, right? But overall, of course, especially in the Western economies, the populations are shrinking, and there are other channels that are at play as well. Sort of older populations start fewer firms. There's like less entrepreneurial activity, and people have linked that to basically less fluidity in the firm/labor market, and therefore also less growth. So at the same time, obviously, the aging population exerts greater demands on the public sector, right? On provision of healthcare, provision of pensions, and so with slower growth in the Western countries, that that becomes a sort of a double challenge, right? A double whammy that I think is the main challenge for policymakers. So I think it's an unresolved, very interesting issue. As I said, I think the main hope, I guess, is that population growth within each country is slowing. At the same time, the economy, in this idea sense, is globalizing. More people are participating globally in that idea generation process, and so hopefully that's going to provide some insight.
On the question about the intellectual history, I mean, I do write about it. It's one of the really interesting things that when you look at the classical economists, not just Mill when he writes about economics, but also Smith and Ricardo, what they all have in common is this idea of a stationary state. They disagree on whether it's a good thing, but all of them in the back of their minds have this view that economies are kind of tending towards some sort of stationary moment. In fact, the only classical economist who really bucks that trend is Marx. Marx is the guy who believes that, in some sense, among all of the growth can go on forever. Growth is an incredibly important process for carrying society the way it needs to be. So I think I do write about it. It's very interesting. It's part of the explanation for why the idea of the idea that we can keep on growing forever is actually such a sort of problem. On the question of sort of commodification, I write about this a bit too, because there's often an argument that there's something sort of crass and materialistic, consumeristic about growth and the pursuit of growth. I mean, what that then comes up against is the fact that, as I said, that growth is also associated with almost every measure of human flourishing come up with. I also think that when you look at how much the amount of leisure time that we have and the sort of diversity and quality of our leisure, I think there are lots of different measures that push back against the sense that the growth is somehow that criticism of growth that it's somehow materialistic. So I'm more skeptical. That isn't for me. I think growth has an immense price associated with it, but that's not one of the big ones.
Do you agree then?
I think so. I mean, there was a lot of growth before the modern era of financialization and commodification. And so I think that's more a characteristic of financial institutions and labour market institutions. Thinking about those and pushing back on what Beth Potburnham calls the economic style of reasoning being dominant in so many areas of policy would be a way to address that.
So we have about 8 minutes left, so I'll take one more round of questions and then I'll ask this to wrap up. So that's a close so I can see hands and John's and
I have a question about climate change. We said the stern report that 1%, then went up to 2%, and now it's gone down to 0.5%. That seems a very low figure to me. Other estimates have been more like 3%, but because of that zero. Are you 0.5% to reasonable figure?
great. And small hands from here.
Very, very interesting. I look forward to reading the book. But I want to pick up the point about innovation, because you seem to regard innovation as being necessarily good. I agree that innovation, when it dematerializes the economy, I think your example lectures too. Fine, good. But there's a lot of innovation going on now, which turns out to have really reverse or damaging effects. Just one example is Facebook. Originally it came out great, communication so on. Now it's echo chambers, which are perverting democracy. That was motivated by Facebook's need to make a profit. So it's not we who control the technology, it's corporations. Same thing with these things. People are addicted to this. Damaging children's brains, addiction to it. So I challenge your idea that we want more innovation. I think we need to have innovation second, but I accept that there's a problem with we in the sentence, but we need to put the values first and control innovation, and that's a very difficult thing to do. AI is already almost done. Things like deepfakes. So I think we should be starting not from GDP and growth, but from values. Like Diane's work on the on natural capital, on the natural environment, on everybody's basic needs should be met. A few other things you can add to that. And then growth would be kind of a means to those ends sometimes, but sometimes damaging. So it would be second. So I think we should be talking about values embodied in molecular systems, which Diane says that's the incentive and the success, how you evaluate success.
Great, thank you. I think there was a hand up here, Steve.
Yeah, it's a little bit more of a comment. I'm Eslan Masood.
Maybe a short comment.
I'm a science journalist. I work for Nature. It's really in response to Doug, to your question, and kind of connecting it with what the point that Diane made about the sort of the political economy of GDP setting. I mean, I think it's so, although there is, and I understand, Diane, that there is a process underway to, in a sense, to reopen aspects of the index. It is the most incredibly opaque process that I've come across in almost 3 decades of following the United Nations processes. I mean, Doug, it's as if though climate change had no businesses, no NGOs, no media, no campaign groups following it, and just people making decisions, admittedly experts in political, but without that sort of overlay of the population and community involvement. And that's the problem.
Great. So if our panelists could consider those comments and questions and maybe reserve the way to offer any closing remarks, and Diane, that's for you.
Well, thank you. Gosh, I would love to get more people interested in economic statistics. It's very open. So I'm very interested in participation approaches to it. People are going to innovate, whatever. And I think of it as not it's good or it's bad, but what are the tools that society has? Can we stop the bad innovations? Let's tax advertising online. Let's put social media people in prison if they don't adhere to their duty of care. let's subsidize things that we care about and tax things that we want to see less of, and that's the way to corral innovation.
Thank you.
Yeah, maybe I'm just gonna make up on the same point just to finish out. I agree with that, like, just to echo what I was saying earlier, you know, ex ante is very, before the innovation comes about, it's very hard to know what it's going to bring, right? But I think exposed, we have plenty of tools to control some of these things. As you hinted at, the political economy of that will be challenging, right? But that's you know, the right way to go, I think, is to exactly go, you know, after these incentives and interest groups, etc., rather than try to have a, you know, this more blanket policy of holding back innovation or degrowth. I think that's a more targeted policy in that sense is better.
Thank you. I'm done.
The point about the 0.5%, I put it up there not because I wanted to hold it up as the sort of gold standard of what the estimates currently are. I wanted to put it up there as an example of how over time these estimates change. And 15 years ago, the estimates were on a sort of upward trajectory. Today, I think over the last 15 years, the trajectory has gone down. And the reason is because of the types of tech, not simply that there's been technological progress, but because we have developed particular technologies that have allowed us to weaken the trade-off between growth and the climate. And in the future, our ambition should be to change incentives in society even more to weaken that even further. So I imagine it. I was talking to somebody who's worked with Nicholas Stern and some of his work, and if you spoke to him today about it, he would argue that that actually there's a negative cost that taking climate change seriously would increase rather than decrease GDP. It's just so different from where we were 15 years ago, and the reason it's different is because the technological progress is taking place, and that's what we should be encouraging more of, not simply with respect to the climate, but with respect to the other harmful effects. And it relates to the question about innovation. I agree with Diane. I think it's wrong to think in terms of pro or anti-innovation. I think there are particular types of innovation. What we would be doing is encouraging the sorts of innovative technologies to both promote growth and also protect the other things that we care of. On the issue of the opacity of how it is that these numbers are calculated and gets to decide, I completely agree. I think it was your book that I used in writing my own to try and get a sense of what goes on behind how it is how it is we rely on the particular processes that we have and how it changes. So, and the argument, part of the project in this book is to try and show that these questions about what we measure, what we choose to measure, and what weights we put on the things we measure are, again, some of the most important political questions that we have to answer as a society. And the place to answer them is in politics, not in and we ought to be exploring how we can push some of this, and how we can engage more citizens in it rather than statisticians and experts.
That's a lovely place to end our conversation. It's been an incredibly rich conversation. I do hope that you can join us for drinks just outside, which we're moving on to now. Please do stay. I think you have books for sale, yes, right? And will it be signing one shop? Excellent. And so do buy the book. Very big thank you to UCL Amsterdam for partnering with us, and to all of our speakers, and particularly to
It's been a long time.